Hi, everyone. Welcome to Voices of Western, the Humans of Western podcast.
This is where we delve into everyday stories of students, staff, and faculty on campus.
Be sure to check us out on Instagram at humans_Western.
You can also find us on TikTok, YouTube, and our Facebook page, Humans of Western. My name is Zainab.
And I'm Kevin. Today's episode features Wes Kinghorn, a professional squirrel caretaker and Harry Potter election campaigner. But more on that later in the episode.
Outside of saving animals and exposing the magic world to muggles, Dr. Kinghorn is the founder of a 3D digital imaging company based in London.
He holds a Ph.D. in urban geography from Western and is a postdoctoral scholar in public history.
Outside of that, he makes the time to give back to the community, from leading workout workshops to being the president of the Urban League of London. We were delighted to be joined by Professor West for this episode. We hope you enjoy all the fascinating topics discussed.
We got to hear about Elliot the Squirrel. What's happening here?
Well, Elliot the Squirrel is an interesting story. So one of those kind of fun pandemic stories, if they exist, I guess. But early on, it was probably about 2 weeks into when all of this started. And it was still at a time, actually, that we didn't think this was going to take very long. We were still thinking this might be a month or 2 months, that sort of thing. And the local kids, I in my neighborhood am sort of known as the guy, if there's an injured animal, you can bring it to me. I've always had an affinity for urban animals. And so people bring them to me, but what I usually do is I bring them to a great place like Salthaven, who can do rehabilitation of the animal and release them in the wild. I think that's always for the best, right? If they lose a parent, best thing we can do is get them right and release them to the wild. Well, these two little squirrels, or this one little squirrel at the time, was given to me, and he was, he clearly had been kicked out of the nest, and he was dehydrated and hadn't eaten in a while, and he crawled right up to me when the kids set him down, and you could just tell he was desperate, right? So when I called Salthaven at the time, they were in the pandemic too, so they had no volunteers that could come in. It was a really strange time, and there was just no one who could take him, and they had no options for me. There was no one anywhere in the province who could take this little squirrel. So I took Elliot in and went online, Googled, and learned how to make squirrel formula. He was that young. He was still drinking formula from his mom at the time that he lost her, and I had to learn how to feed a baby squirrel formula. So for months luckily it was a pandemic, because I could every 2 hours feed this little squirrel, and we became very, very attached. But I didn't want a pet squirrel. So my whole mission was to get this guy re-released into the wild. His name was Elliot, a good friend of mine, Jenner, a big Disney fan, and we were talking about Pete's Dragon, that movie, and the dragon in that movie is called Elliot, and we thought, he's a really brave little guy, let's call him Elliot. That's a good name for him. So his name's Elliot, and the idea was to release him to the wild. So for months, as he grew older, I had to learn what he was supposed to eat at each stage, feed him the right foods. But then more importantly, I had to go out and sit. I sat under our front tree with my laptop computer and worked on my laptop while Elliot learned to climb trees. And I'll still remember the first night Elliot ever decided, and he decided this on his own, that he wanted to sleep outside. He climbed to the very, very top of the tree, and he hunkered down into a few little branches, and night was falling. And usually I would go, Elliot, and he would come back down, jump on my shoulder, and we go in the house. This night, he just did not want to come down. So I'm a little pathetic this way, but I got a sleeping bag out and slept on the front porch all night just to make sure he was okay. And the next morning he was hopping on my chest, and it was about a week later, he just decided he was wild, and off he went. But he still comes and visits me every single day. It's probably about almost 700 days since I met him, and he comes and visits me every single day. Yeah. In fact, he was just here about half an hour before this interview.
No, that's so cute. That's adorable. Okay, now that we heard about Elliot, we want to hear more about you as Dr. Wes. Would you mind introducing yourself?
Sure. My name's Wes Kinghorn. I am an assistant professor in geography here at Western. I've taught a number of different courses, some social justice type courses. I taught world cities last term. My mainstay, though, is the geography of tourism. I love that study. I look at, I know we're going to talk about this more later in the interview, but I love looking at the world from the sense of place and placemaking, spaces versus places. And it's a really interesting way to look at tourism. So that's the tact I take. But in my life, I also am very involved in heritage preservation. I have a postdoctoral. I've done postdoctoral work with the public history program, and held positions such as the chair of the Urban League. I'm currently the president of the Architectural Conservancy of Ontario London branch. I was the chair of the London Advisory Committee on Heritage. So I look at heritage from that placemaking perspective as well. So that's me in a nutshell.
Wow, one thing that definitely stands out about you is how involved you are, and it's just so I can tell that you really care about all the different things you do. So I guess if we were to dive straight into this idea of placemaking, could you explain to our viewers what placemaking is, how you became interested in it, and yeah.
Yeah, well, and actually that's a good way to ask it, is how I became interested in it, because I did my graduate degree and my master's degree at Western many years ago, and was looking at urban geography, and I was involved in technology, and went off and have had a company for many years that looked at three-dimensional digital imaging of places, working with planners and architects, and looked at it from the industry side for many, many years. I became interested in place, though, because I moved into a little downtown neighborhood called Woodfield. And Woodfield, at the time I moved into it, was London's first and only, at the time, heritage conservation district. I didn't know that when we bought our house here. It was just a really cool old neighborhood, and I really liked the old houses, the beautiful old architecture. So but I became the chair of that neighborhood association, more just because I like to get involved and I like to improve where I live and improve the, of course, place I live. And I started to get interested in how people connected to our neighborhood a little differently than they do to some other types of neighborhoods, how they felt very personally attached, not only to the architecture, which is beautiful down here, and of all scales and sizes, and it's just a really cool place to live. But there was, by extension, a very unique and diverse group of people who moved into this area for the same reason. So I was really curious about why living in a heritage district impacted people and how it impacted people living in these historic old houses. And that got me interested in a concept, a geographic concept of place, which is the idea that a space is an anonymous space to you. It might be a park you've never been to. It might be, a city you've never visited. If you don't know much about it, if you have no connection to it, it's just a space. It becomes a place when it has meaning to you. So spaces become places as they have meaning. And there's lots of different ways that we derive meaning from places. So one of the ways is we attach to the people and to the physical setting. And those are two important elements of placemaking. You need to have a physical environment that attracts people to it. And then you need to have the community that builds around that physical environment so that you become sort of simultaneously attached both to the physical and the community aspects of this space, and it becomes a place to you. One simple way to think of it would be if you were dropped into an anonymous park. And you looked around and there were trees and benches and things. Well, it really would have no meaning to you. It would just be a space. It would be a park. You'd know it was a park, but it would have no meaning to you. But if you then moved near that park and you walked your dog at that park and you met your friends and had picnics in that park, every time you interacted with that park and people in that park, it becomes more meaningful to you. And eventually it becomes a place. It becomes a place in your world, and it has meaning. And when spaces become places, we become very interested in them. We start to love them and want to protect them. We love both the structure and the community, and we become very engaged and involved in it. And it's a good way to preserve heritage districts. It's also a key, and we'll get to this, I'm sure, in a couple of minutes, as to how tourism works. Paris is just an anonymous place to you until you've read about it in a book, and the book meant something to you, or perhaps your parents went there when they were younger and they've always told you about it. But somehow you start to connect at a distance to a space, and it becomes a place to you, and it becomes somewhere you want to visit. So that's how I basically look at the concept of space and place in a nutshell.
I love that concept because it actually relates to people. Like you can recognize, locations that you see as places versus ones that don't have meaning to you. So it's just so
Absolutely.
applicable to people. And moving to tourism, as you mentioned, we talked about in the Geo of Tourism class about the changes that, are happening during COVID and then that are maybe expected to happen post-COVID. So would you mind telling us more about that?
Sure. COVID has, of course, disrupted life everywhere and in every way. And we've all adapted astonishingly fast to this. But one of those areas that probably struggles the most is tourism. And there's a good reason for that. One of the key ways that we tried to stem the flow of COVID between different countries and so forth was to reduce our travel. And that was a way of kind of slowing down the movement of the virus country to country. Very controversial at times when we would slow down the movements to certain countries and not others. And this has been a really interesting conversation we've been having throughout COVID. Well, one of the sort of obvious impacts of that, as you know from the course, we talk a great deal about how one of the major reasons that tourism became something for the masses, something for the average person, was because of cheap and available flights that we could for a time fly easily between countries. When that stopped, and it really did largely stop globally, all sorts of places that relied heavily on tourism. Some, I mean, even Canada, Toronto relies heavily in some ways on tourism. Even London, Ontario relies, of course, quite heavily in some ways on tourism. But there are other places in the world that rely almost entirely on tourism. Tourism is really where they make all of their money. And so that just ground to nearly a stop. And the only other comparable time in modern history would be the World Wars, when something similar happened, when all movement on Earth for pleasure really did grind to a halt. So what happened? We basically cut down, and some interesting things started to happen that we talk about in the course as well. An old concept that came up during one of the biggest recessions of the staycation, the idea of vacationing where you live, suddenly became very important to us again. We had local hotels and local restaurants and local attractions that suddenly stopped looking outward for clients because they just weren't there, and started looking inward and thinking, well, how can we appeal to, say, the next city over, or a few cities over, or our own people who live right here in London, Ontario? So COVID had that impact of completely restructuring for a couple of years the entire idea of tourism. And in many ways it ground to a halt, and in other ways people got very, very creative and started to look inward and find new ways to revive the concept of the staycation.
Right. I definitely had, like I was talking to Zainab before we started this, and I was trying to think of the staycation and how it applied to like friends and family around me. And I think that is something I witnessed as well. It seems like it kind of just, people needed to get out. And I guess one other thing, I recently tried to get a hold of a travel agent, and super hard. Right now, there's a lot of demand for traveling.
Yes.
So people are kind of expecting this travel boom to kind of happen. So based on your expertise, like what are your thoughts on how we move forward from, I guess we're not fully past the COVID era, but what's going to happen moving forward?
So it's an extremely complicated, and it's a really excellent question, because if we were to look at the past indicators, like World War II, World War I, where there was a complete halt to tourism for a time, and then it came back. Historically, what happens, and it's true this time too, is that there is this pent-up demand. 2 years now of people wanting to go places, remembering the beach they were on, remembering even traveling for family, traveling to see relatives they haven't seen in years and years. But on top of that, pure tourism, just wanting to go somewhere for fun, right? Because we haven't done that in so long. We haven't even been able to have as much fun as we'd like in our own communities, and certainly not those memories we might have. And the younger generation have never had a shot at it, right? Just as they were coming of an age where they could tour, it shut down. So what happened in our past examples is there was this massive pent-up demand that results in a boom of tourism. And my anticipation all along was that would be what we're in for. And I do believe that is what's coming. We'll have a real boom in tourism coming down the road. What complicates it is that pandemics, unlike, say, a war which ends and then we start to move on and rebuild from it, what happens in a pandemic is there is a linger to some of the feelings that we've had. An example being, are we comfortable anymore being so close to people on an airplane? That's a big unknown question at the moment. There seems to be indications that demand is starting to really fly now that it's available, but there will be a contingent of society who just don't feel comfortable anymore with that idea. So they may take some time to get back into society. The idea of masking, in Ontario, we're talking about the masks coming off right now. When the masks come off, are people going to be hesitant to go out? Are there those who have become so accustomed to living in a world where a mask is part of your safety net? When they lose that safety net, how comfortable will they be to move into environments like concert venues, large type airports, all the things that are so closely, sports venues, right? Massive sports venues, soccer games. How comfortable are people going to be? So there may be a time where that initial demand that we expect is tempered somewhat by a difference in how people, how comfortable people are moving back into the world of tourism. Certainly there will be a boom, and certainly it will come. Will it come in a massive wave like we've seen in past times when tourism has stopped? Maybe. Will it come in more of a slow building wave? And maybe that's what we're going to see. So it's a good question. I wish I could tell you the answer. I don't think anyone knows the answer, but it will be fascinating to look at. And for students of tourism, it will be a wonderful time to sort of look at how tourism rebuilds and what we build toward now. So it's an interesting question. We'll see.
Mm-hmm. Even with staycations that you mentioned earlier, I feel like people now look at their own, like just like Toronto. I live in Burlington, and as for vacation, people just went to like hotels in Toronto just to, as a vacation. And now they see it differently. They see Toronto as a place of more fun than they used to. They were more inclined to go, out of Ontario, out of Canada. And now it's like, I guess it's just more attractive to them than before.
It's a really good point. When we had the major recession that led to the concept of the staycation initially, it opened up a somewhat new area of tourism, and the door never closed. So you are right. I mean, when you look at the sort of arc of tourism pre-flight, most vacations were somewhat like staycations. You really couldn't go that far from your house. Train travel expanded that quite dramatically, boat travel, but that wasn't really available to that many citizens. The car massively opened it up, but you could only get so far in a day in a car, right? So the tourism was much more quote unquote local in the early days. Then air travel sort of took off this idea of traveling to distant places and very different cultures and expanding your knowledge of the world. But when that when the recession took hold and finances for people started to shrink, and they looked inward again, they reimagined the idea of touring close to home. And you're exactly right. I think we're going to see a little of that happen again. I don't think local tourism will entirely disappear in favor of distant tourism. I think there'll be some kind of a blend of that, just like we saw after the recessions, where yes, tourism to other places will take off again, but it's already ignited this idea of looking at your local market for tourism and trying to work with that as well. And I agree with you. I don't think that's going anywhere. I think that's going to be here to stay once again.
Yeah, that's
me thinking about as the evolution of transportation has kind of made traveling a lot quicker.
Mm-hmm.
The next stage, like I was going to make a joke about interplanetary tourism, but even before that, I know there's a bunch of companies that are looking into flights that kind of go on the edge of the atmosphere.
Sure. Yeah.
So if that becomes more feasible, a lot more affordable, what kind of things do you see like happening with that accessibility increasing?
You're really looking into the future of travel, and certainly not in my lifetime will there be travel to other planets or anything like that, but you're definitely touching on what there will be increasingly is tourism that takes you to the outer skirts of our Earth, right? It takes you to the outer atmosphere. And just like air travel, when air travel first was invented, of course, the average citizen wasn't getting into an airplane. That took a long time before we got it to a level that it was feasible to commercially fly almost anyone on an airplane who had enough money to get on, but you didn't have to be rich anymore to do it. Well, we're in a similar phase with that sort of tourism, with what we're calling quote unquote space tourism, right? And again, don't get me wrong, we're not likely to see trips to Mars in my lifetime, but you never know, things change very quickly. But likely we will see more and more, the tourism to the outer atmosphere will become more efficient, will become better at it, and more competitors will enter that game. So it may never become like air travel because you're really not going anywhere. The experience is to get to the edge of the atmosphere, and that alone is the trip. But I certainly think you will see more and more people who are not necessarily the ultra rich taking those sorts of journeys. So it's certainly a vanguard of where tourism is going to go in the future. And after I'm gone, who knows where they'll be going, right? So.
No, Kevin is just super interested in anything space, so that's obviously
Sure.
his first tourism connected to space as well.
Fair enough.
But I've heard that obviously in the class you talk a lot about New Orleans as your kind of
Yeah,
favorite place to travel and stuff. What
absolutely.
are some places that you think are rich in that kind of sense of place?
There are so many, it's almost countless. I mean, everywhere has its own sense of place. But since you bring up New Orleans, that's a really good one to use as a bit of an example. It is my favorite city on earth. It's such a unique place in North America. There are very European elements to it. It was Spanish at one time and French at one time, and there's a Canadian influence, the Cajuns, the Acadians who moved up. There's all sorts of influences from all over the world on New Orleans, and its history dates back hundreds and hundreds of years as the metropolis it sort of became. But because of that, it slowly grew. And when we talk about sense of place, I mean, New Orleans is the kind of place that has everything. It's got everything you're looking for. It's got a very unique music scene, jazz scene that we all know, but also many other things. Zydeco, which is a sort of country hinterland musical style. They also get into world beats, rock. Everything takes place in New Orleans because people from all over the world flock to it. And there's a food in New Orleans called gumbo, and gumbo is basically you throw everything in a pot and let it boil together. And the city of New Orleans is a gumbo because there are so many cultures. Jazz came, of course, from the Black community and the Black experience, but it also came from First Nations experience in which people don't always know, but there are influences as well that created this thing called jazz that is so American now, right? And there are, of course, the musical stylings of like the French Acadians who came in and brought in this idea of Zydeco. And there is food everywhere. I mean, you've got seafood because you're on the coast, and you've got very, very modest foods because there was such a big working class there. So po' boy sandwiches, they call them, which are these sandwiches that are just basically like a submarine, but they'll put fried seafood into them, right? So everything about New Orleans is a very, very unique thing to that city. So it's got one of the strongest sense of places of anywhere I've seen on earth. But there are many, many places like that on earth. Really, when you start to think about sense of place, the places that win in the tourism game are the places like New Orleans that build that beautiful history and uniqueness in music, in culture, in people. Often the blend of people is really important too. Having different influences from different parts of the world that came together and fused, that makes a really unique place, right? Because that fusion, you may find the individual elements in cultures all over the world, but the fusion of the cultures is what makes it really interesting. So these big metropolises often are known for that. Manhattan is, of course, a big one as well as another American example, but we talk a lot about Paris. Paris was one of the earliest ones that you see that happening in as well. They're all over the world.
That's so nice.
Oh,
It
I didn't
definitely
know
made me want to visit the place. New Orleans.
Yeah.
there was a lot of things like jazz being influenced by the native people. I've never heard of that. That's very, very interesting.
Yeah, there were originally, it's a complicated story. Jazz is a much disputed musical type. New Orleans calls itself the jazz, the place that jazz was created. And, you know, I'm no musical expert, so you'd want to have a musicologist on to talk about that. But from my own experience, the story is pretty strong that is where it came from. And it was, again, this
Wow.
mixture of different cultures working together to create this unique musical style and influence the musical style from different directions. So it's really, really interesting.
So that does make me wonder. We talked about this tourism boom that's likely to happen. How, I guess we have a lot of like turmoil and tensions around the world between countries.
Yes.
What part does tourism play in potentially bringing harmony or more interconnectedness in the world?
I think that's a really good question, especially with what's going on in Europe right now, and we're in very troubling times, a lot of what drives this is our separation as people. When we don't get to know each other and we don't feel connected to people in other places, it can cause us to see them as caricatures and others, right? But when we get to know them, when we start to connect to them on a deeper level, that's when we can bridge those differences. And tourism is uniquely positioned to allow us, because One of the things we get into in our course is this concept of the host and the guest, how these are two sides of a coin that create tourism, and both sides bring something to that game, right? Tourism doesn't work unless there's a willing host and an interested guest. And so when we look at a place from the host perspective, you're inviting people in. And whenever, imagine just in your own home, right? When you invite someone into your home, you're taking a risk, you're exposing yourself and your surroundings to someone you don't know very well. It's such a generous gesture to invite someone into your home. Tourism is the same thing on a much larger scale. When you as a country decide that you want to have tourists come to your country, you're welcoming them as the host. The guest is doing something similar. They're taking a chance to move outside their comfort zone, the place they grew up, the place they know well, into a place where they know they don't fit in right now. So they have to trust that host. They have to have faith that that host will take care of them, protect them, make sure they're okay when they're there, right? So this relationship is intrinsically one of trust and goodwill. Now, not always. We get into it in our course that tourism can be a bad force sometimes and can be exploitive and can cause lots and lots of problems. But in its finest moments, tourism is just that. It's a trust relationship. It's a symbiotic relationship of two sides, the host and the guest, working together to cross differences and have an experience that will be a lasting one for both of them if it works well. So the answer is that, yeah, tourism can be a major force in our lives for getting to know other people from places that we're not familiar with. And it's very hard when you have spent time with someone to hate them. You know, when you've gotten to know them individually, it's very hard to hate them. And it's a simplistic, perhaps, way to see the world, but I think it's certainly a small part of how we could do better as people, is to come together as much as we can with as many different types of people as we can, and to see the world in the right way, in non-exploitive ways, but to see the world and to see it through as many different perspectives as we can. And I think there's certainly an argument to be made that the better we do that, the less we'll have to deal with this anger and hatred. I think there's a pretty strong argument there for that.
Wow, what a beautiful message. It's not something I've really thought about, but I think the way you laid out, it seems like, as you said, it's hard to hate someone who you know well. And even if you have moments of feeling annoyance or hatred towards that person, you understand there's nuance and this is a whole person. Whereas, as you said, if you have a caricature type idea of someone, it's very easy to just like see them as one-dimensional.
You said it. That's exactly right. That's exactly right. One-dimensional is the right way to look at it. That's how it works. We only know them on that one dimension, what we've been told by others, right? Until we actually interact with someone. It's like when you hear a rumor about a person, right? And then you meet them and you go, well, that's not right at all. This person's not like that at all. When you can only rely on secondhand information, your picture is very skewed by whoever handed you that information. So the best way to overcome that is to see it for yourself and to experience it yourself. Yeah.
I love that. I guess to wrap up now, is there any last messages you'd like to say, or anything you'd like to say to tell the students?
Sure. Well, I wonder, do we need to talk at all about the Harry Potter signs to tell them what that whole thing was about?
Oh, yes. Yes.
That would be a pretty incredible way to end this off.
There we go. Why don't we end it that way? So why did we do that little Harry Potter thing? Well, the reason is, I'm a longtime studier of place. I've been involved in many different historic things, and somehow the two things in my life that actually got any news were my squirrel friend. Little Elliot's actually made the CBC and went Canada-wide. He's probably the most famous squirrel on earth, and it's so weird when he comes to my back window every day. I think, wow, you have a clue how famous you are. And the only other thing I've done in my life that got comparable notice was, again, the silliest thing in the world. It was an election, federal election. I had noticed that, in every federal election, it's one of the most divisive times in any country, of course, because rather than living the way we usually do, which is neighbor to neighbor, just having a good time, sure, we disagree on stuff, but who cares, right? In elections, you got to take a camp, right? And who are you going to vote for among these different groups? So it's a pretty divisive force in culture and society. And I noticed, the kids kind of suffer from that because they see their parents who love each other most of the time suddenly getting into fights over things that to them seemed like nonsense. So I thought, I gotta lighten this up. So the weekend before the election, well, little ways before the election, I went to Vistaprint and I made these Harry Potter election signs, just a few of them. There was one for Harry Potter, and I made different parties for everybody. There was he was from the Gryffindor party, and they all had taglines, and Hermione had a party, and Dumbledore, or sorry, who was it? Voldemort had a party, and Remus Lupin had a party. So I just randomly, without telling anybody, woke up a few days before the election, went around my little street, and just put the signs up on different people's lawns, so they were all like voting for a certain member of the Harry Potter world. And I think it was just like the squirrel coming at the right time. It was a difficult time, and Elliot represented hope in a really tough time to people, and so he went wild. This was the same thing. I think people woke up and they were tired of the divisiveness, but for some reason this went global. It was in major newspapers all over the place. Places like American news networks like Fox covered it. I had like this, I had a British children's magazine do an article on it. It just went everywhere. And I got to tell you though, I did a lot of interviews for that, and it's very hard to tell that story. I'm so happy to tell it now, years later, but when you're telling the same story, and eventually I'm just like, it's just 4 signs. I don't know how much more I can say about this. Anyway, there's your final thought for our episode.
That's so perfect. Yeah, I saw the articles. It's like signs random, like magically appear in London.
Yeah.
The titles got me. It's so funny.
Yeah, they were all working with a lot of puns.
Yeah.
You know, it's funny. I think what made that work so well was that I didn't own up to it. In fact, in a lot of the interviews, especially early on, I never even owned up to doing it. I just sort of pretended I lived on the street. So I think the magical nature of it kind of helped a little bit too, you know. Yeah, if you read some of the early articles, I'm trying to be cagey. I eventually gave up.
Yeah.
Like it's the same person showing up in all these places. I think might be a connection here.
Yeah, exactly. But it was fun. And you know what? If those are the 2 things I'm known for, a squirrel and some Harry Potter signs, I think I'll call it a good life.
You do all the hard work, and this is what
you're known for.
All right. Thank you so much for being here. We loved having you.
That was really a good conversation.
I know. I really enjoyed it.
It was a pleasure, Dr. Wes. Thank you, and have a great rest of the day.
You as well. Very nice talking to you both. Talk to you soon. Thanks again for having me on.